I would like to go ahead and move into what I think is going to be a great time. Y'all can see on item 3 the credentials that Dr. Sponenberg brings to us today. He has been a huge help to me over the years, even though I've personally never met him. I remember his articles back in the ALBC publications, and then a book came along that he helped co-author called A Conservation Breeding Handbook. And that book set the premise of what our flock is doing today, still today in line since 2006. We still maintain those lines, and the flock has flourished. I have him and the co-author there to thank for that. I've emailed him over the years. I've asked questions. I've followed his comments on chat sites concerning color coat genetics, and he is honestly a major influence in what we do, including our association, because he advised us in the past on the topics he plans to cover today. So, Dr. Sponenberg, we look forward to your presentation, and we'll let you go ahead and start.
Real quick, I'm sorry to interrupt. We just had a call-in user join us. Wanted to verify that they can hear.
I can. My signal dropped.
Oh, okay.
But this is Cynthia Glass. I'm sorry.
No.
Dr. Sponenberg?
Yeah.
Give me just a moment here, Dr. Sponenberg.
Okay.
I will get everybody set up to be able to see you. Hopefully everybody's now focused on your screen and ready to give you the full attention.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, sure. These these virtual meetings are sort of strange, but that's okay. So the first question for Charles Taft is, what's for lunch? But there he goes. I've known Charles for years, so and he's been a great help to the Livestock Conservancy. I have some comments, and then they're not going to actually take all that long. So what I'm hoping is that we have more of a good discussion going. And I guess to start off, obviously you breed St. Croix sheep, or you're interested in them, and this type of breed is a really, really interesting case study and breed definition, how we develop them, how we conserve them, how we breed them. And that's because it started off on St. Croix. That's why they're called St. Croix sheep. And the first importation was in the 60s. That pretty much got absorbed into the Katahdin breed. So the Katahdin has a whole lot of St. Croix in it, but other things as well. And then Warren Foote imported a bunch of them in 1975. And that's the importation that we really think of, because, basically it goes ahead and stays within the St. Croix gene pool. So it was brought in, as you know, to be a hair sheep alternative to wool sheep, especially at a time when wool prices were real low, and just for the adaptation and the management simplicity that the breed brings. So anytime that you take a breed from one place to another, it helps to, kind of figure out, what really happened, both where it started and where it came from, and then where it ended up. And, if you go back to the 70s, everybody's idea of a breed was that it was fairly uniform. They should all look the same and they should all do the same. And we do have some, especially in North America and a lot in South America, we do have land races that are just kind of these local breeds that are isolated, certainly qualify as breeds, but they don't have the uniformity of external appearance that we expect, from something like a Suffolk or a Hampshire or a Merino or something like that. So Gulf Coast sheep, Florida cracker sheep, Navajo churros. But in the 70s, they hadn't received much attention. So these sheep come in, and basically sheep breeders don't realize that it's okay for sheep breeds to have some variation to them. So they go down there, and basically on the islands, the breeding is fairly unorganized. And then they come up into the North America, where it's very highly organized, and they fit into this breed concept that we have here. Now, I've only been to St. Croix once, and it was probably 25 years ago. Could have been 30 years ago. And actually, when you got out on the roads and you looked at the hair sheep, and these were pretty decent hair sheep. A whole bunch of them were white, a whole bunch of them were black belly sheep, and some were spotted up different colors. So you had quite a bit of variation. And but underneath that, the basic type of the sheep was, fairly consistent. You wouldn't think that there were a bunch of crossbred sheep, but just one breed with a bunch of different colors. And this is so much so that while I didn't write it down, I'll go ahead and tell you that if you look at a lot of the research from Virginia State University, they will actually do breed comparisons of St. Croix sheep and Barbados blackbelly sheep. Well, it turns out that some of those Barbados blackbelly sheep were blackbelly sheep from St. Croix. They weren't from Barbados at all. So that shows you how the color kind of confuses breed identity. They basically, some of the sheep I saw in St. Croix were certainly good blackbelly type sheep, and you can find them in Mexico, you can find them in Cuba. So the importers go down there, and they're struck by the nice, big, smooth, white polled sheep, and so that's what they bring up. But it's important to remember that this is a sampling of what was down there. And of course, St. Croix is part of the United States, so importation was fairly easy, and it probably still is. Now, they went after uniformity, which is understandable given the time frame, and they went after big, productive, framey sheep, and within the constraints of the breed. But that's also understandable and defendable, because if you're going to go to all the expense and all the trouble of importing, you're not going to go down there and import the rattiest looking little spotted sheep that you can, because that makes no sense. But I mean, this is basically what happens, and the result is you end up with a bunch of white, polled, nice looking sheep. Now, so with every breed, what you have to do is you have to figure out what's the boundary around this breed, what really defines it. And so the question is, what's in, what's out? It's a really, really interesting question, especially when you look at the island. What would count as a St. Croix sheep on the island? What would count as a St. Croix sheep up here? I don't have answers. I just have questions. Now, but there are some important details. If you focus on the white and you focused on the polled, those are both due to dominant genes. And when we talk, genetics, all the dominant means is it can hide stuff, and all the recessive means is it can pop up as a surprise. So if you have white polled animals and they come out of a really variable population, you can end up with some surprises. You can end up with colors, you can end up with spots, you can end up with horns, you can certainly end up with scurs fairly easily. And all those variants have probably been on the island since the beginning. Basically a sheep was a sheep. And then these surprises are going to pop up, and then what we do with them matters, because it helps us define the breed, helps us figure out what we're going to do as breeders. And there's, basically there is some utility to a breed having a calling card, having a certain look where people can recognize it easily as that breed. So color to me is, I'm fascinated by it, so I'm biased, but it's also a fairly trivial difference, because once you peel these things, they all taste just about the same. So, that helps us kind of put it into a context, but, the advantage of a pure breed is that it's going to perform fairly predictably. And so having an animal that's clearly identifiable as a specific breed helps. So if we have a completely black-bellied colored St. Croix sheep, it's going to be too easily confused with a Barbados black-bellied sheep. That may or may not matter, but it's just the way it is. Now, horns are probably a variant that the breeders will see quite differently. They're useful in some situations, especially, if they're acting against predators and things like that. They're a disaster in others. If a horned ram comes for you, you got to figure out what you're going to do next. And, I have not met that many Wiltshire horned sheep, but every Wiltshire horned ram came for me that I've ever met. There's 2 or 3. It got horns, and it makes for an awkward 5 minutes when you try to figure out how we're going to, figure out how to manage this horned ram. So polled sheep, I can certainly understand why that would be a good thing. Now, I've raised goats, polled goats, nice idea. Horned goats, a little bit easier to handle in my situation because they have handles. You can kind of manipulate them that way. So horns have uses. Would you want the whole breed to be horned? Probably not. And in goats, the horns actually help with thermal regulation. They actually shut body heat away from the body into the horns. And on a reasonably warm day, if you have goats, you can go out and feel the horns. Those horns are going to be hot because that's how the goats stay in cool. So horns, we could have a long discussion about those. Probably no right or wrong answer, just different situations for different people. Colors, probably more trivial than horns. That may or may not be actually true when you look at the fine, agonizing details. And if this gets to be boring, just fall asleep. But the reason the sheep are white is due to a specific genetic allele, so a specific genetic variant. And the gene that causes sheep to be white also causes sheep to be a little bit bigger, also causes sheep to be a little bit smoother, also causes sheep to be a little less prolific, and also causes sheep to be a little less likely to breed out of season. Now, this is going to vary with everything else that's going on in the sheep, because obviously something like a fin sheep is white, and yet it has really, really high fecundity. But if you had a single gene pool, single gene population, and you had some white ones and you had some black belly ones, you'd expect on average, if we had 200 of these of each, on average, the black belly sheep would be a little bit smaller, the white sheep would be a little bit bigger. Black belly sheep would give you a few more lambs, like 15 per 100, something like that. So just something to think about, because it does, over a huge population, it makes a little bit of a difference. But if we're just going out and evaluating individual sheep, which is what people usually tend to do, boy, those white sheep are going to stand out, because on average they're going to be a little bit bigger. And if you raise wool sheep, some of you probably do, most of you probably don't, but a lot of breeders of sheep where they have a breed that has both white and colored sheep, they will tell you that it's very, very rare for a colored sheep to come up to the standard of the white sheep. And it's because of this single gene difference. So, I used to work with Leicester longwools. And with Leicester longwools, the black sheep are almost invariably a little bit smaller than the white sheep. Those white sheep are a little bit bigger, a little bit smoother. And that can be important when you're evaluating the sheep. So moderate differences over a huge population over long periods of time, that makes a difference in what we're selecting for. So if you select all the animals for size, growth rate, after 200 years, you're going to end up with all white sheep. If you're selecting for out of season breeding and you're selecting for high levels of multiples, you're probably going to end up with colored sheep, over the century that we don't have. But, those sorts of rules kind of fit in here. Now, some white sheep are prolific, some white sheep breed out of season. So obviously it depends on what else is going on and everything you're selecting for. So on the island, the St. Croix is a variable landrace, local breed, poorly organized. On the mainland is much more of a standardized breed, and that's partly because of Foote's attitude when he brought him in. So the white polled external appearance was really, really important. But it's still going to hide some of that original island variability, and that's still going to pop out. And then you as breeders get to figure out what you're going to do about that. There's no right answer. There's just an answer, and you just have to come up with it. One response is you just avoid any variation. Everything's got to be white. Everything's got to be colored. You can always eat the other ones. No harm done. So in the St. Croix, you could insist on this by just making all registered sheep white and polled. Keeps the breed recognizable, keeps the breed consistent. Nothing wrong with that. Potential downside, though, is sometimes a sheep with one of these unacceptable variants is truly exceptional. It's a really, really great sheep, except it's got horns or it's got color. And those actually do have, since they're the same gene pool and they're excellent sheep, they really do offer something. And so how to use those and not lose your breed identity is important. But especially in a rare breed, sometimes it becomes important because you want to make rules, but you want to pay attention to the long-term viability of the breed, the long-term viability of the whole population. Now, an alternative to keeping them white, keeping them polled is the other extreme would be anything goes. Just basically no holds barred. Anything gets in, as long as it's purebred and got registered parents, color and horns. As long as the sheep are purebred, you don't really lose much by this, except you lose that calling card that the breed has of being a white polled hair sheep breed. Now, especially in a temperate environment like most of North America, it's a pretty easy environment, and so that nice recognizable calling card becomes pretty important. If we lived in a really, really demanding environment, then I would consider Caribbean environments to actually be fairly demanding, especially for sheep, because you fight the heat, you fight the humidity, you fight the parasites. Survivability in that situation is going to trump everything else. So especially in an environment like that, I would ignore everything else except survival and productivity, because that's the main focus. So some of these cosmetic differences would matter very, very little in that situation. A middle approach is possible, and that's probably the best for most rare breeds. You want some variation, but you also want to give a nod to the historic preference for this white-polled sheep, especially up here on the mainland. That's what I had planned to talk about, and it didn't take very long. And now hopefully we can have some discussion going. I have received a few questions, questions on color, and my understanding, and if I get any of the details wrong on your association procedures, correct me gently, because it's just ignorance. It's not, hopefully not stupidity. And my understanding is that you do accept some variation, especially scurs, and then somebody can tell me if actually ever do really see a truly horned sheep, and also some for color. Now, and you also have at least, if I'm inferring from some feedback I've gotten, is that you may have a second registry going for sheep with elapsed registrations that are likely purebred but lapsed, and then also sheep that are known to be crossbreds. And for my two cents worth, and since you had me talk, you're stuck with my 2 cents worth, those two things are really, really different. A crossbred sheep is a crossbred sheep. A partbred sheep is a partbred sheep. A purebred lapsed sheep is a purebred sheep. You have to have really, really good validation that it's a pure sheep. But once you can validate that, that is a purebred sheep, even though it had a lapsed background. Now, another question came up, when we do DNA testing and all this, how likely is it that we're going to ever be able to do a DNA test and say, yep, this is a St. Croix sheep, regardless of what color it is, regardless of whether it has horns or not? That for sure that this is a purebred sheep because you can do a gene test. Now, that's asking a lot of genetics. And in most breeds, in most situations, it is asking more of genetics than genetics can give you. Okay, now that's the background. Now, it turns out that island populations with long isolation usually have a fairly low level of genetic variation. And in that situation, those genetic tests can actually be quite accurate in showing you that, in fact, this is, without a doubt, a purebred St. Croix sheep. Now, I don't do that. So you'll have to, the lab at Davis or other, I don't know where you do your DNA testing. Those sorts of things can put together a profile. Now, that said, it is extremely important when you put that profile together to sample as broadly as possible. Now, the Cadillac of this would be that you would sample, basically all bloodlines or all flocks here on the mainland, and you would probably go down on the island and you would actually sample there and see if you could detect any differences. Those may be important in the future. An example of the uses and abuses of this genetic testing come from Dexter cattle. Dexter cattle in England, they did this massive DNA study. And what they did was they tried to include all the herds. Well, it turned out that one herd that had been isolated for decades and selected under the eyes of a very, very excellent animal breeder that had a very, very specific look in mind, turned out to be genetically different than the rest of them. And so what they did was they said, well, that must have been from crossbreeding. Well, a Dexter cow is a Dexter cow, and in that part of England where this herd existed, there was no logical choice for a crossbred animal. So in that situation, probably what happened was they just simply inadequately sampled originally to include those variants in the purebred profile. And that is a mistake to avoid if you possibly can. So yeah, it's a really, really useful procedure, but it does have some pitfalls. With that, let's open it up. If you have a question, I can try to answer it. Or if you have a point of discussion.
January, that was when I had the
I'm going to unmute everyone. What I would ask you to do, Jody, you can help me if I'm going about this a less efficient way. Unmute everyone, and then if you have a question, please kind of indicate that you have a question, and we'll try to go in some sort of order. If you are participating by phone, if you can just say your name and I can at least keep a list and we can try and go down that. So, Jody, is that a reasonable way to handle this?
Well, if you unmute to everybody at once, you may get a bunch of back noise coming through. It would probably just be recommended that if somebody has a question, feel free to speak up on it. Or if you'd like to, if you're online, you can chat it in the chat window to everybody that I have a question. That is also an option too.
Okay.
And for the phone callers that are muted, you can hit *6 to unmute yourself again.
Okay. Have we got anyone typing a question here?
And I'm monitoring the chat, so that actually, for those of you that are online, that usually works out pretty well.
Right. Our audio callers may have trouble doing that. I think it is our only issue. So if you're on your phone, I think you just need to unmute yourself and we'll just try and go in order, as best we can. So.
I have a question.
Who is this, please?
Charles Taft.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Phil, the question I have, about 2.5 years ago, I had a friend of mine who I had sold some St. Croix lambs to back in June of 2010. And then the next year when those lambs were ready to be bred, I took one of my registered rams over to his farm, which is maybe 30 minutes from mine. And he started breeding, and I sort of assumed that he would be registering his animals, but as it turns out, he was a busy doctor and didn't have enough help, and so he really didn't register his animals. And about 2.5 years ago, he called me to say that he says, "Charlie, I've got a problem. I called the county extension agency to look at my pastures because they were so eaten down, and they said the first thing they said is you've got too many sheep." And so he was willing to give me 35 ewes at that time. So I went over and we loaded them on my wife's cattle trailer and took them up to her farm in Southwest Virginia at River Ridge Farm near Independence. And they have a large cattle farm and beautiful on 2 occasions now to my registered ram. But of course, the ewes are full-blooded, but not registered. And I was just wondering if there's any way I could register that. Is there a registry out there that I could register those unregistered animals that I'm getting now? I can't really tell the difference in the registered ewes and my unregistered ewes when they're born. So they're not looking animals, and they're pure-blooded St. Croix, because I know the breeder, and the only thing he didn't do is register the sheep that I thought that he might be doing.
Yeah, that's an important issue, and it's going to this is where your association gets to decide what to do. I can't tell you what to do, but this situation pops up periodically in lots and lots of breeds. And some of the examples, so the Sponenberg opinion is, as long as you are satisfied that this flock was isolated and purebred, that those are in fact purebred sheep, even if they've lapsed the registration. Now, there's a problem here. And the problem is, when you do it that way, it's really, really good for the genetics, but you are encouraging bad behavior. Okay. So that's bad citizenship, and we're going to stick with that. But, for managing a breed, especially for managing a rare breed, this can become extremely important. One of the most interesting examples I know of is in New Zealand. The Leicester Longwool breed is very, very rare. And they found a flock of something like 200 or 300 of these things where they had lapsed registrations, but that's all they had was Leicester Longwools. Well, in a situation like that completely changes the fate of a rare breed. But then you have to convince, the good citizens that have kept their registrations up that this is a good thing for the breed. So that, that's a political decision, not a biological one. The biological decision is that, yes, those should be included back in as full representatives, as long as you are satisfied that they are in fact purebred, even if the registrations have lapsed. And you have to remember, a century ago, in most sheep breeds, it was very, very common to register rams and not register ewes. So if you go back in the old flock books, especially for the English breeds, it'll have all these registrations for rams, no registration for ewes. They just assumed that people were going to keep, purebred ewe populations.
Okay. The other observation I would, as you were talking about color and horns, I've only seen, and I've been dealing with St. Croix now for about 13 years, and I was up visiting Linda O'Neill in Suffolk, Virginia, and she showed me a recently born ewe that was black, and it was probably 90% black, and that's the only really colored lamb that I've seen in the St. Croix. But like you say, it does pop up occasionally. It's in the genes, in their background. But I've only seen one really black ewe, and I've had a few that have had spots that were bigger than a 50-cent piece. But that was my experience with the color, which is not very common.
I actually owned, I don't know if you can see this, I owned this sheep for a while, and this is a black and white St. Croix, and he was in fact a St. Croix from registered parents. So, it does happen.
Okay. So you, in answer to my question is, it would be up to the association how to deal with a purebred St. Croix, and how it might be registered or not be, or be excommunicated, so to speak.
Yeah, well, what you need to do is, as an association, you come up with a general principle, which is fine, and then, but in every situation, you always want to come back, and each one of these rescue situations is very, very specific. But you want to have a general framework to put them into. So you need a general framework, but that's not an automatic pass for this situation. Every situation has to be looked at individually, and that's fine.
Okay. I think that, oh, sorry, Dr. Taft, are you finished, or is there another question?
Thank you.
I have a question.
And who am I speaking with?
Karen Fogarty?
Karen Fogarty, go right ahead. And also, Dr. Sponenberg, in your chat, I believe I saw a question come in there, and I know I put one in. So first, Karen Fogarty, please go ahead.
Yes, I live close to the area where the other association originated or whatever. Anyway, when I go out to try and buy a ram to outcross, which I do occasionally, mostly I have a closed herd, I have to be very specific who they're registered with, because it's gotten to the point where if I buy one from the International Association, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to register them.
Yeah, that's another political situation, and the associations will simply have to decide how much mutual recognition there's going to be. I work a lot with rare breed conservation, and I work a lot with breeds where they've fragmented breed associations. And there's at the time that there's a fragmentation, there's always a real good reason for it. It doesn't really serve the long-term interest of a breed very well. I'm going to go ahead and take a few of these chatted questions. Other people can weigh in. One question is, has anybody noticed St. Croix with horns having a larger body size? I'm not going to have I don't have experience with that. And then, how many generations might it take to stabilize characteristics of a new breed like Royal White or Katahdin? It's going to take, it depends on how uniform you are and how much you select, but you're looking at a minimum of 5 generations, probably so. Something like this. Another question, we have colored sheep that come out of some top ewes and rams. These ewes are exceptional and are also top animals in the flock. Line breeding was also utilized to some degree to continue the lines, and they have maintained a loud black and white color in the process. And that's going to be typical. And some lines are going to have these variants, some lines are not. And that does not reflect on the line's purity. It's just some have it, some don't. So if you line breed, that's going to be where you're going to see these recessive things come out the most. Do we say a time when we have divergence in St. Croix in terms of colored and white, with both being St. Croix but both considered purebred? Just consideration of natural selection with direction from breeders and the propensity of the breed to favor attributes of the breed, like I indicated earlier, is this something we want to encourage and maintain in the registry? And again, yes, over time you could diverge, and you have to decide if that's a good thing or a bad thing. So, and that's a decision for you. Even if you start initially with a purebred stock, it varies. And then here one is fragmentation is a human problem, not an animal problem. And yeah, pretty much, especially when you talk about splits with associations. And it's real interesting because often the splits come from deeply held, sincere beliefs. Other splits come more from just trying to assure economic edge.
Do we have any other questions? Feel free, if you can even signal me, or if you're on the phone, *6 will unmute you and allow you to speak to the group.
I have one thing to add about the horns in the St. Croix. It hasn't happened for me very often, but many, many years ago, we did get a ram lamb who had horns, and he was the biggest ram lamb in the entire flock of lambs that year. I've also done a little bit of crossbreeding with some Katahdins in St. Croix, and every now and then horns do pop up when I do the crosses as well. And they are also some of the bigger lambs of the group too.
Thank you for that input. For Karen Fogarty, on the issue of kind of cross-registering between international and this group, I have asked our registrars to look at the pedigree of a lamb and tell me that if it could be registered or a ram before I actually bought it, because that, is a potential issue. And thus far, I've had good luck doing that. They've all been able to be traced back, but that is an option to avoid buying an animal that we don't have the background for, in the registry. So, for what it's worth. Okay, other questions? Anyone? *6 will unmute you. Is there nothing else for Dr. Sponenberg?
We had one come up in the chat. Oh.
I'm sorry, I'm missing this. Where am I going?
She accidentally sent it privately. I think she accidentally had the to section going to the presenter, to the host. I can copy this back into the chat.
Okay. So we're getting a question from the chat. Okay.
Yates, Colby.
Yeah, okay, so from anecdotal experience, there is only a small percentage of purebred colored sheep born in the St. Croix breed. I would expect that. What you do with them determines the future. And for an example, in many wool breeds of sheep, that percentage is probably 1 or 2%, something like that. As soon as you don't eat that colored lamb and you use it for reproduction, you can rapidly change the frequency of that. So, currently, especially because they're white, that's going to be a very, very small percentage. Not all white sheep carry color, some do, and it takes mating 2 of those together to bring that out. Once you start mating those colored sheep, the incidence of that is going to go up rapidly. And again, this is value neutral. You get to decide what that means to you. And then somebody wrote in, so no need for another registry, and no need for.
That's a human decision.
Yeah. Can't help it with that one.
Sure. Okay. Are there any other questions out there?
Dr. Sponenberg.
Hi. Yes, this is Vanessa Baradari.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Yes, I just was trying to read the room a bit and find out, coloration in the St. Croix, are we looking for this for, is it just purely personal preference? Is resale or larger body size? Is that what we're discussing? I just want to make sure that I kind of understand that. I've never had coloration occur in my St. Croix, but nor do I have a preference for that unless it's going to produce a stronger quality and a larger body size on my sheep. So does anybody have any chime in on that?
I think Dr. Sponenberg kind of went through some of the characteristics that are associated with the colored sheep versus the all white one. So I guess it would depend on what your focus is on. You know, in other words, what you're trying to do.
Are people finding resale that they're selling at a higher price? There's much of a desire for them?
Well, now, let me weigh in here because that's actually an important point, because as soon as color becomes the focus, that's probably not healthy. You know, you need to just be evaluating the sheep, and if it happens to be a colored sheep and it's a really good St. Croix, then that's perfectly acceptable. If it's only valuable because it's colored, then you have to kind of raise your eyebrows at that. And that does happen in rare breeds, especially with rare colors. Dexter cattle in 1900 were black and horned, an occasional red one, an occasional dun one. Today, they're red in their poll, and that's a very big change for a host of reasons. We won't go into all of them, but when that becomes the focus, the breed stands to lose something.
Okay, that's great information. That's kind of what I was getting at, so thank you.
Thank you for that question. Okay, is that everything from everyone, or do we have someone else? *6 if you're on the phone, we'll unmute you.
I'd like to weigh in just 1 second on the colored, because I've had a little bit of experience of that in my past, because back when the unmentional split happened, I was dealing with a lot of color in my flock, and I just kind of sat there. In fact, if you guys go to my webpage, you'll see me holding a set of triplets that one of them is absolutely solid jet brown, and I've had a lot of brown and black. So I unfortunately got rid of a lot of those because that was right before the split, and that was back when color was evil. But if I had held on to a few of those, we don't want to disregard the genetics that those animals could have had. So they could still be good animals and they could pass them along. I was the one that asked about the horns with the larger body size, because this last breeding season was my first year to have any horns or scurs on anything. And I've got one that has a nice set of horns actually growing in. They're actually starting to curve back on his head a little bit, and he dwarfs everything, and he's pure St. Croix. So I don't think we should, like Doc said, we shouldn't breed for that, but we shouldn't dismiss those genes either. But if we're doing our due diligence, we're going to keep those animals and see how hardy they are and run them through some rigorous tests. And we're going to make sure that it's a good animal for years to come to be able to keep those breeds, those genes going in our breed.
I think that's a very good point.
I think the animals with scurs, it's the same thing. Sometimes you can't even tell when you register them, and then later in life they get a little bony prominence, and they've already become the largest ram that you have. Do you throw them away or do you use them? You know, it's kind of a quandary.
Do we have any responses to that, Dr. Sponenberg, or a participant?
Well, I mean, I tend to ignore things. A good sheep is a good sheep, and so I would actually ignore the color and ignore the horns. But that's just me. Some people are going to put different value on that, and it depends on the individual breeder. It also depends on the community of breeders, which direction you want to go.
Okay.
I think if one of our sheep, we should probably be running through those tests and making sure that it's got the genetics that we want to pass on as a breeder if we're selling them as breeders. So just like Doc said, you know, disregard the color and the scurs and the horns and make sure it's a good animal.
Questions? Anyone? I think this might be our last opportunity. *6 if you're on the phone and wish to be unmuted to speak.
Yeah, hi, this is James Sutton. Hopefully you can understand my accent. I'm actually
Of
from
course.
New Zealand, so obviously we've got some background with our sheep there, for those who've been there. We've got a relatively small flock, but my question was not really a question, it was just more a general comment for the breeders in the community here is, you know, everybody seems to have different reasons for why we want to actually raise St. Croix. There are obviously commercial considerations in terms of size of sheep and quality of the meat and the breed and stuff for that purpose. And the other side of the coin, of course, as Phil has kindly stated, and I thought that was interesting, was maintaining the best characteristics of the breed. You know, fecundity, you know, making sure that the breed actually produces multiple animals, quality animals and healthy animals as well. Good moms and the traits that make St. Croix, you know, parasite resistant and all those really good things. But they may not necessarily be seen in the white breeds. There may be something stronger in the colored breeds. So I was just kind of curious what people's reasons for actually raising St. Croix were generally. From our perspective, just to open this up, we only have a very tiny flock, thanks to Matt Morgan, much appreciated, and a different Jason as well. But we're primarily interested in our conservancy initially because we're relatively new to this breed. We're kind of interested in seeing what happens, what we can do with the coloreds, what we can do with those that actually produce larger sheep, and just see how we go over the years. I know that there are a number of breeders that probably produce sheep for commercial reasons. So obviously size of animal and markets are a consideration. What are your opinions on that in terms of how this kind of fits into the registry and your long-term decisions, if that makes any sense at all?
Okay, responses to that.
I raise them because they're the only thing that'll survive here. I'm in Alabama.
Okay. I have to say, I'm in Oregon, which is about 180 degrees on the climate, and these are the sheep that will thrive on the very poor vegetation that grows here. And that's why we raise them, for their hardiness, among other good characteristics, but that's the basis.
There's a few flocks of...
I second what they said from Alabama. They're the only ones that survive down here for me, too.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm assuming that's due to parasites. Is that the main reason?
Yes, parasites and foot rot and every other disease you can come up with.
Okay.
Parasites and heat for South Texas.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've had listeria. I've had some get the meningeal worms, liver flukes. But they seem to go through that until you see they're not doing too good to do a test and find out they got them. Other sheep, if you get them, they just drop dead.
Okay. Anyone else? Why do you choose St. Croix? And I guess I'd be asking, what do you do with them? In other words, what's their purpose?
I eat them.
Okay.
And in the South, your land gets totally overgrown. Within one summer, you can't bush hog it if you don't keep animals on it. And these sheep will keep it looking like a golf course.
My favorite quote comes from Alice in Wonderland. And when Alice is faced with the Cheshire Cat, she asks the cat, "Sir, where should I go from here?" And he goes, "Well, where do you want to go?" And she goes, "Well, I don't much really care." And then he says, "Well, then it really doesn't much matter which way you go." And that's important because each one of you as breeders needs to figure out where you're going. And it's not going to be the same place.
Larger. I try for larger sheep, as well, because when you eat them, it's easier to butcher a larger sheep and get more meat out of it. And they grow faster, and it's just a better sheep overall. But you just can't find other sheep that can survive these conditions.
Okay.
So, answer that from my side, what I do with them is I try to breed for the best of the best. I look for size, I look for parasite resistance, I look for hoof rot resistance, I look for muscle structure. I try to find one that is going to have all of it. And I've called pretty heavy over the years doing that, and I've got some decent ones that do okay. So I think if we just breed for size, then we're going to start keeping all the biggest, but not necessarily the best. The biggest isn't always the best. Sometimes some of the medium-sized guys might have more parasite resistance, and you got to work your way up a little slower so that you can get to where you want to be and actually honor the breed.
Well, the non-parasite resistant ones get really small and really bad looking. The parasite resistant ones tend to get much larger. They look much healthier. They got more meat on their bones. I guess it's just the culling is kind of automatic. If I have to save them, they're puny little sheep and they don't have any muscles and everything else. If they thrive in spite of parasites, they grow well. I hadn't seen a lot of other sheep until 2018 at the other meeting, and my sheep were easily as big as any of the ones there. So I don't have a lot to compare to. I have a ram that I got back, and he did have parasites. He was 9, but somebody had him with Alzheimer's, and I don't know where he kept him. His feet were a foot long. And I wormed him once, but that's the only time in 9 years, and he'd been in half a dozen commercial herds in the meantime. And he's taller than Yates, if you don't mind me saying, taller than the ram I got from you. He's not as meaty, but he's still worth keeping in there. So,
thank you for your input there.
Yeah.
We're approaching the end of Dr. Sponenberg's time with us. Are there any other questions for him there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead. Who is this?
This is Roberta, and I am very new to sheep, but I did pick the St. Croix because I'm in inland Northern California. They are doing fine in 100-degree plus heat, and they are, we are really appreciating that they keep the brush down for fire control reasons. And I would definitely put in a vote for genetic diversity and robust resistance to parasites, top on my list.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Lori, this is Kim
Yes.
Songer.
Yes. Hi, Kim.
Hi. And as you know, I got my sheep from you. And
Right.
also for eating the grass. And I'd like you to know that they are just a couple of big dogs.
We do find these sheep have personality when they're raised with people. That's been my experience. So that's great. Questions for Dr. Sponenberg? His time is just about up.
Sorry, I think one more person put in that they have a question in the chat.
Hello.
Okay. Yes. Are you the person who put a question in the chat saying a note that you have a question? No. Go ahead, please. *6 if you're on the phone.
All right, I'm on the phone. Can you hear me?
Yes, Eddie, go ahead.
Hey, I would like to ask Dr. Sponenberg how much effort it would take to get any kind of genetic profile done on the breed would it take years or just kind of would there be someone to guide us into that if we want to start looking at have to identify the sheep by genetics only?
Well, it depends. You could test one a year for 100 years, or you could test some from every flock once and do it one time shot. So it just depends on what you want to do is sample as completely as you can. And so you all know your own flocks. In my herd of goats, if I've got 60 goats. If I took the 20 oldest ones, I've actually sampled the entire genetic diversity of my herd. Yeah, it's probably going to be something like that. And as long as you have a broad sampling, what you want to do is make sure that you include these small isolated flocks that may not participate all that much, but you want to be sure to include them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I think that's all we have here. Go ahead.
Okay, the question came through. The comment on the nature using a landrace breed and a crossbreeding program. That works, but you don't want to. You want to make sure that your landrace, in this case the St. Croix, survives. And so one of the hazards of using landraces in crossbreeding is that you can use them up. This happens a whole lot in cattle where you have small adapted cow breeds. They're always mated to these big terminal breeds, and then they never reproduce their own breed type. And then pretty soon people wonder where that really, really productive old little cow went. Well, that's where she went. She went into the crossbreeding program. So, you can use them, but you need to make sure that you're taking that top end. And again, how you define that top end is going to vary person to person, region to region, and that's okay. You're going to take that top end and make sure that that's what you're reproducing your pure breed from.
Okay.
I have something to add with that too, because I've used St. Croix to cross from everything from Suffolks, North Country Cheviots to Romanovs to California Reds. This is back when we first discovered the St. Croix, and we were a wool sheep operation. We threw the St. Croix ram on anything we had to see what would happen. And the biggest thing, with this breed being a hair sheep is you start losing the wool on the belly. You don't have to crutch them. And then you start noticing that their feet might start being better, their parasite resistance start getting better, and then you just keep crossing them. But that's one thing I noticed from the years of doing it. I mean, we started back in, I think, 2000 doing that, and then we just started buying more and more purebreds and having registered.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, one last question. Any genetic issues with the St. Croix to look out for? Scrapey codons, double muscling, etc., as in some other breeds? We're not going to have time to talk about scrapey. But when you breed for resistance to scrapey, all you are breeding for is a prolonged incubation time. You are not breeding for freedom from the agent that causes it. And I know this from experience because I was the one that imported Wensleydale sheep into this country in the 1980s, and we lost one to scrapey. So that ended that importation. And the experience in Iceland would bear that out. They really, really like scrapey susceptible sheep that do not have the disease, because then they realize they do not have it. Now this gets regulatory in a hurry, and this gets into laws and regulations. But the biology of it is, for my money, I would much prefer to have susceptible sheep that never showed scrapey, because then I know I don't have any risk of scrapey.
That's something I know a viewpoint I haven't approached, but you're right. We could talk for another whole hour on scrapey resistance. There. I think we're done with the presentation for our meeting. I'd like to thank Dr. Sponenberg. It was useful, very interesting information, valuable to the members, regardless of the reasons that you raise your sheep. And we appreciate your time speaking with us especially during the holiday season. So if it's all right with you, sir, we'll let you go back to your holidays.
Well, actually, more like my work day, but that's okay. Thank you.
All right.
Good luck.
All right. Thank you, sir.